Hello, and welcome to MNA's Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and I serve MNA as the Director of Ecosystems Development. Well, when disaster follows disaster, when a pandemic gives way to a tornado in a church that's only been meeting for 6 months, it's easy to question, God, what are you doing? However, when Grace+Peace in Ooltewah, Tennessee were recovering following the Easter night tornado, the Lord revealed those who were not initially part of the church's target group, but they were people in need of word and deed and an opportunity for the church to learn and grow themselves. So how might a church respond? Well, today we're joined by a few of those who were on the ground in Ooltewah, Tennessee, and can tell us the story of what happened there. The story is the focus of a new video that was released last week by MNA's Multiply. And we have with us as well the directors of two vital MNA ministries. Well, our guests today are first is Don Boeher. Don works with Multiply, and he has been a television producer for some 30 years. He's now in his second career as a senior staff on MNA. He wears two hats: media producer and assistant ESL, English as a second language ministry director. Part of his responsibilities include MNA's Multiply. Just recently switched from print, a quarterly print version, to a monthly video version. Also with us again is Benjie Slaton. Benjie is the pastor of the church planter of Grace+Peace. It's in Ooltewah in the Chattanooga suburbs. Benjie and his wife Natalie have 3 teenage children. Before moving to Chattanooga in 2018, Benjie served as RUF campus minister at the University of Texas in Austin, as well as on staff at All Saints Church in Austin and in Redeemer in San Antonio. Nancy Boeher is the ESL Ministries Director for Mission in North America. It's a position she's held since its inception in about 15 years ago. Her role is to help churches start and maintain healthy ESL ministries that serve the nations that God has sent to our doorsteps. Since beginning of her position, the national team has helped over 500 churches of various denominations start ESL ministries. Pat Hatch is with us. Pat has been working in various roles with refugees and immigrants for more than 40 years. Since 2014, she has been MNA's Refugee and Immigrant Ministry Director, coming alongside PCA churches to help them to welcome, engage, and develop authentic redemptive relationships with those from the nations whom the Lord has brought to our communities. Eduardo Centurion is the program officer at the McClellan Foundation. He's married to Joy, and they have 4 kids. Before working at McClellan, he was the community outreach director at New City Fellowship in Glenwood. Eddie emigrated from Paraguay to the U.S. with his family when he was 10. He's a member of Grace+Peace. And finally, Pablo Mazarigos. He's a marriage and family therapist at the Family Justice Center in Chattanooga. Originally, Pablo's from Guatemala, and he's a deacon at New City Church in Eastlake. Well, before we jump in, I want to, as always, encourage you, those who are attending with us for this webcast, to engage in the conversation. We have the chat box and the Q&A box down below. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into our panelists. We'd love to be able to, as best as we can, when and where we can, to answer those during our time together. Well, let's get underway. This is really kind of part 2 from last week. We heard about the disaster response with MNA disaster relief that was there. But Benjie, give us a little kind of quick rundown of what happened. You arrive at Ooltewah, just outside of Chattanooga. You're planning a church, and then what happens?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. Excited to be here and share some of what God has been up to with you. We showed up in 2018, and like all church plants, gathered a group, and we had just started meeting on Sunday mornings for worship in September of 2019, which was great. Things were going well, and then the pandemic struck in the spring of last year, as everybody knows. And then that was in March. We stopped worshiping in mid-March, like most churches, just trying to figure out what we were doing. And then the night of Easter, which Easter was in 2020 was one of the lamest Easters anybody can remember. Watching Easter services on video is no fun for anybody, especially pastors. And but that night we had a major tornado that came through the eastern side of Chattanooga, as well as some areas around Georgia. There were a number of areas that were hit by tornadoes that night, and so we went from being a fledgling little church plant, just getting our feet under us, to being in the middle of a disaster response, and then in the middle of a pandemic, and then a disaster response. So it was a lot. One of the reasons that we were interested in this area of Chattanooga, we are in the northeast suburbs of Chattanooga. And one of the interesting things about that area in particular is that there's a big Volkswagen manufacturing plant there and a lot of subsidiary industries. And so it has attracted a very diverse group of people who have settled in that part of the city. It used to be, horse farms and small farms, people who wanted to live in the country. And over the last 2 decades or so, the city has enveloped that area, and it has become an area that all kinds of different people are moving into. So the population in our area is fairly diverse. It's you have on my street alone, as I look outside my window, I have folks from all over the world, Volkswagen executives from Europe. We were friends with a Bulgarian woman who was married to a Canadian man, Mexican nationals who've come up here to work in various capacities. This is the area of town where you have a lot of South Asians, a lot of Indians. You have a lot of immigrants have landed in this part of town, Central American immigrants. If you're a middle-class African American, this is often an area where you land because of schools and things like that. So one of the things that attracted us to this area was the possibility of having a bit of a more multicultural church experience than often what you get in some southern suburbs. One of the particular areas that we noticed as we were getting to know the area was that one of the largest trailer parks in Chattanooga is nestled right in the midst of one of these little, hills and valleys in our area, and called the Auburn Hills Trailer Park. And didn't know much about it, but was fascinated by the fact that it was nestled in the midst of kind of custom home developments there'll be $1 million home, and then a couple of trailers, and then there'll be a 50 house development, and then there'll be a couple of rundown houses. And it's just a really interesting part of town that frankly I didn't really understand, but was more curious about, and hoped that we would have the opportunity to have some impact there. And in my hopes, I wasn't hoping for a tornado, but that's what we ended up with. So I guess that kind of got us up to the present day. One of the people in our church is a guy who's lived in Chattanooga a long time and done a lot of ministry in Chattanooga in various ways, Eduardo Centurion. And one of my first calls was to Eddie to kind of say, hey, what are you hearing from folks? What do we need to know? What do we need to do?
Okay. So Eddie, why don't you pick it up from there then? So you get a call. And again, as I remember, Benjie, you were trapped in your neighborhood and your cell phone didn't work.
Yeah, I mean,
initially.
the tornado kind of came through and just, almost sat down on our side of town. It's a very broad set of destruction in our area. Thankfully, my particular home was fine, but the entrance to our neighborhood and the woods behind my house were completely flattened. We couldn't get in or out for a couple of days. Cell phone service was bad. I had to walk up the hill to a different part of the neighborhood just to get a little bit of cell coverage. Yeah. And we didn't have power for 9 or 10 days. And so Yeah, I was not in a particular position to lead, but thankfully we had a lot of people who were ready to pick up the ball, and Eddie was one of those.
Good. So Eddie, tell us what took place. How did you get engaged? What happened next?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. Yeah, and kind of this response came out of an earlier response. We're trying to figure out. I work for the McClellan Family Foundations, and us with other nonprofits in town and other foundations and the United Way. We're already kind of daily getting together for Zoom. How do we intervene in response to the pandemic? What is the pandemic doing to the nonprofit sector in our city? What are the needs so that conversation was already happening on a daily basis here in Chattanooga. And my role, because we're a Christian family foundation, was to really engage churches in general, from all denominations in our city. So that was a part of the conversation that was happening prior to the Sunday evening tornadoes. So very quickly went from, okay, how do we coordinate services to respond to a pandemic to, wow, how do we safely help those whose homes have been destroyed? Most of the damage was part of the neighborhood of East Chattanooga, East Brainerd, Chattanooga, pretty middle-class suburban houses that had insurance, but still, tornado doesn't care how wealthy or poor you are. Those were where we saw the pictures on the news, were just these houses that were just completely destroyed. It looked like a war zone. So churches began to mobilize along with other nonprofits and just citizens and saying, how do we respond? But pretty early on, I would say within a week, we began hearing about this one particular neighborhood that was, like Benjie said, it's tucked in. You would miss it if you didn't stop by, because it was covered up by trees and it's a trailer park right next to really, really nice homes that was hidden back in there. Well, the management of that particular mobile park made the news. And unfortunately, it was national news of how they were mishandling relief efforts and supplies that people were sending in. That's how they first came to kind of our radar. And I began to connect with churches that were thinking, how do we get in there? How do we serve? Covenant Pres, which I know you spent some time talking to them, were the first. Well, that was kind of the first church. They're right down the street from them as well. So that was the first couple of people we began to talk to. Okay, what do we do here? How do we do this? How do we come and help this community that most of us, including myself, I mean, I knew of them, but I didn't really know them. So how do we come in and how do we help, especially when there's tension between management and the people that are seeking to get helped? I knew of one Latino nonprofit that was already on the ground, La Paz, Chattanooga. So I knew the executive directors. I connected with them. But then through Pablo, I actually connected with a nonprofit. It was a small, actually, I don't even know if they're a nonprofit yet, but they're working on the nonprofit status. Very small group called Tennessee United. And they were the ones that started connecting us. They've been boots on the ground from the very beginning. And they're the ones that kind of brought the bad news to light of the management. So Pablo and I connected and said, how do we begin to coordinate churches?
Okay. So Pablo, what happened as you guys got connected and some of the coordination with other churches?
It's kind of hard sometimes to think about what was going on in that church or in that community on my mind without kind of just thinking where I was at mentally and emotionally. This was the pandemic. We were all stuck at home. I'm a guy that likes to be pretty busy, and I work leading counseling groups in the public schools. So I was just encountering high levels of irritation Um, and I remember I was trying to put my shoes on or something, and my wife calls me to do something for my son, and I was just about to storm in anger. Freaked me out, because that's how the mental state that I was in, just overwhelmed with the pandemic, and kind of freaked myself out as I started realizing, man, I'm pretty angry. Just felt like I had lost a sense of purpose, um, because all of my work revolves around public schools and or being in the schools, and I couldn't do that anymore, and just felt lost. Um, in that, I remember one afternoon, a pastor friend here from a local Baptist church, Gus Hernandez, he calls me and tells me that they're needing a um, translator over there. And man, I was hyped. I was so excited that someone reached out to me, because I felt like I was, I was just stuck and I couldn't do anything. Now, mind you, this, you're talking about a pandemic where you you can't really be around people. You're concerned about getting too close, because you're hearing and you're learning that this is killing people and the spread of it. Um, but at the moment when he calls me, I didn't even think twice. I'm like, yes, I'm going. Um, and I just went there. And so really the way I got connected was through um, uh, my friend Gus, and I get there, and yeah, it's a complete war scene. Seeing all sorts of trees down. Um, it's just a small neighborhood, so the entrances are kind of blocked. Then I hang around with. It's kind of weird, and so I guess what I'm trying to get at is it's a combination of church bodies and church denominations. They kind of led me to where I was at. So Pastor Gus, friend, a Baptist friend, and then talking with Eddie, and then I get there and there's a non-denominational church who's already there, handing out food, and then I'm asked to kind of tag team with this nearby Pentecostal church. We're gonna go give out goods and help translate, and next thing I know, I then meet this nonprofit, Tennessee United, which is kind of what Eddie was, the organization he was talking about. And so I learned about them. And then I speak to Hernando Sainz with Hispanic Ministries, with MNA. And he tells me, man, I wonder if the PCA has these sheds. I forget what they're called.
Sheds of hope.
Sheds of hope.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, that sounds really good. I should reach out to Stephen Lanier from Jackson, Mississippi. I know Stephen Lanier from when I went to RTS over in Jackson. I then messaged his wife, and then she then tells me to reach out to Mike Kemner. I don't know Mike Kemner, and then we meet via phone. And then Mike tells me about all these other churches around here. Year and a half later or so, Eddie had introduced me to a brother from Covenant Presbyterian, a church here. Dan Steer, I think is his name. I can't remember exactly. He was trying to figure out how to do a ministry with the Hispanic community. I tell him, hey, this is what's going on. He then connects me with Mark, the pastor there, who then connects me with the deacon. And then Eddie or somebody or Mike does the Zoom meeting where you have, I meet Benjie, I meet Mark, and I meet all these other brothers from First Press here, and some brothers later. I come to meet some brothers from Signal Mountain Church, and then we just, it's this big, this big, enormous thing. And then there was this Catholic church. There was a nun who was out there kind of meeting the folks' needs, as particularly, I guess, as they related to their spiritual care and just their mental care. There was a lot of trauma behind just already on top of the pandemic, and then now, just the chaos and the children and just the crazy stories that you hear that, and so that's how I got plugged in. And then I'm pretty sure that'll be a place that I'll always visit as long as I'm here in Chattanooga, just because I was really touched by how welcoming they were, and just how kind, and just a loving community that was just excited to see us, that was excited to meet us. And
Hey, Pablo, can I jump in and ask you a question?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we noticed pretty quickly was, whenever you have a disaster like this, people, kind of descend in. There was a non-denominational church that was feeding people. There were groups that were coming in. The Baptists were amazing at like coming in and doing, tree work. And, this place was set in this pine grove, this grove of old pine trees. And these pine trees had just been like snapped off and were, laying on these homes. They had a couple of deaths in there. And so it was really kind of hard to figure out what was going on. But would you give kind of how would you describe what we learned about the residents in that area? They're a unique, what I thought was kind of a unique, unexpected, to me it was unexpected what we kind of discovered about who these folks were. So Pablo and Eddie, if you just want to speak to that.
Yeah. I operate in a lot of, my field is in the mental health and community development type area. So that's kind of my tendency. And then I'm an immigrant myself. So I think, for me personally, there's so many things that I could say about what we learned about the community. But I think what I've taken most from it is that our community has a story, and it's a beautiful, powerful story. You're talking about a community that's often used as a political subject. You're talking about a community that's often looked down upon, that's generalized by their immigration status. And you're talking about a community that's in the midst of a pretty well-off social class. So how is this vulnerable community who couldn't even access the emergency funds that were available to them, how is this community going to survive where there's immigration barriers, there is language barriers, there's just general housing barriers, and there's transportation, and you have cops and other officers surrounding this place?
Yeah.
I mean, it is facing its most vulnerable, experiences, but yet they bounce back. The community started working with their own hands. If you were there with the typical, hey, let's go help those people mindset, let's rescue them. I think, and no doubt, do you look back and you're like, no, like they did something to me, because they would say, hey, we just want you to buy the material and we'll do the work. You would see moms cleaning their yard with their children. These folks would kind of rebuild the structure of their homes, and I think that's pretty powerful, because any stigma or anything that you would often assume related to this community, whether if construction people could come over there and build with the local immigrant community, how can we not as a church come build a faith community? So I think the defining for me is that we have a story, that we can rebuild ourselves, and that we are relational people that welcome people. And if we can rebuild homes together, man, what else can we not do together? I'm sorry, I probably say
no, just to add to something you're saying, Pablo. Some of the families we met there, some of the folks that we worked alongside, like Javier was someone we came alongside, and he wasn't from the community. He was just I think he was connected to Tennessee United somehow, and he saw his like Pablo and I were immigrants. That this is part of our story. Our immigration status and our friends' immigration status at this park was weaponized against them. Some of the horrible stories we heard about the mistreatment of the management for some of those families is, whenever things would go wrong and they would complain about it, well, they would say, well, we'll report you, so keep your mouth shut. Or some other misinformation from because we're in the middle of a pandemic, the highest rates of positive COVID, especially early on in our community in Chattanooga, was by far like twice as anybody else was the Hispanic community. So there was information going around, even to churches, telling churches, "Hey, don't go volunteer there. You're going to get COVID." So there was a lot of misinformation being told about these folks. But when, like Pablo was saying, when we got there, when we met folks like Sylvia and Javier, Sylvia lived there. And while we were trying to help her with, some cleaning up and redoing some part of the outside of her home, she was more worried about, did we have enough to eat? Did we have enough to drink? She was trying to practice hospitality, and just the way they came and prayed with us, the way they introduced us. She was like Pablo can speak to this. She was a community leader there already. She was an older woman. She and her husband that were looked at by her neighbors, and these were, like Pablo said, these were neighbors that, when help came, they took it. But when help didn't come, they were working out there. They were fixing their own roofs. They were repairing. And I remember, this is something Javier said to me, who was this young man that just kind of stepped in and said, "Hey, I got some skills. I'll come and help. I'm an immigrant too. I don't live here, but I'm going to come and help." I remember him telling me, it's like, when I looked at, and this is the same experience, when I looked around, I was like, oh my gosh, these mobile homes are beyond repair. We should just start over. But these resilient families said, no, we'll patch it up. We'll fix the roof. Can you get us a gift card we'll do the repairs. I know somebody that does roofs. I can do sheetrock. And like you said, they taught us, how to do different things. But I think what was moving was more of how they practice hospitality, how they sought to minister to us as we were thinking, "Hey, we're coming here to help you." It's like, no, So it was a beautiful picture of the church.
I think one of the things that was really important to realize is that one of the things, I think we often have these misperceptions when you look at various parts of your community. I think we oftentimes have a very surface level kind of understanding. We go with our gut. And one of the things we saw there was this was an area that was not filled with kind of degenerate citizens, with a lot of drug and alcohol problems and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm sure there's that, but you saw a lot of intact families, and you saw a lot of people who are working. They're just the working poor. They're immigrants, and they are. And so the first thing that they asked for was just help buying, building supplies. And so we spent money buying Lowe's gift cards and went and gave them to people, and they began to fix their own places. They have a very real sense of self-reliance, and a lot of those people were connected to churches, and we felt like going in, once the kind of big churches doing immediate relief work left, it felt like it left this hole of relationships that I think Pablo has done a lot of long-term work, and we see that as there's a lot of opportunity for the church to step in. For us, the way that I see this is less a story about how much Grace and Peace has done. I see this as a two-part story. Number one, in the midst of a challenging disaster crisis, what I saw as the leader of the church was my inabilities, but the abilities of the church of Jesus to pop up and fill the gaps. This was not something we planned. This was not a strategic initiative. It was God's people stepping into a need that people have and filling it. And so that's the first part. The second thing about this story is that it's an unfinished story. I see this Grace and Peace is, we did not have a plan in place to minister in Auburn Hills. We had an aspiration to one day do that. And so we jumped into the situation as it was. And I don't know that we necessarily, we have not reached the end of what that is. And I think we have more hopes and more questions, frankly, about what we'd like to do rather than solutions to share with people. And, I think for a webinar like this, that's actually helpful. Most of our churches do not have effective ministries already in place in areas that they have aspirations for. And we're one of those. And so we want to be learners, and we want to, in 3 years, we want to have a much deeper engagement than we do right now.
Yeah. What I'm hearing, that's Pablo, the way you described the isolation from the pandemic and the agitation that creates, and how quickly engaging with other people, but with other churches and ministries. I mean, it kind of went from 0 to 60 fast in so many ways. Yes. And Benjie, as you were describing it, to me, this is the beautiful picture, and why also having Pat and Nancy on with us, and then Donna, will get you in to tell the story you were telling of the story that we're talking about. But this is a perfect illustration for us, not just to say, oh, look what happened at Grace and Peace, but look what can be done in our communities. And hopefully it won't always take a pandemic and a tornado to bring it to our attention. So Pat and Nancy, let's turn it to you, because it's for you, these are kind of areas you work in. So as a church encounters a situation, the MNA ESL and the Refugee and Immigration, Pat, your area, let's maybe start there. That could be the entry. Tell us a little bit how you would, you can engage and help churches across the country during a pandemic or not, or tornadoes or not, in everyday circumstances.
Sure. First, I'd like to just commend Grace and Peace for their looking at the strengths of the people that they were going to serve, and coming alongside them as they took the lead. So as the people that you were about to serve took the lead, and you learned from them what needed to be done and came alongside them, I think that's beautiful. And I hope that many of our churches that are trying to figure out what to do in their communities will listen to the needs in the communities they're trying to serve, and look at the strengths of those communities and say, so how can we support them in their strengths? And what can we do to build upon the strengths of the people that we see as having needs, but they themselves have strengths that could address some of those needs if we just came into the gap. And so I'm really encouraged to hear what Grace and Peace did there, and the partnership with other churches. And I think that's the other thing that we as PCA churches need to be aware of, and that is we can accomplish a whole lot more with other churches side by side, because the unique strengths of each church complement each other. So when I'm talking with a pastor or a deacon or an elder who's looking around at the increasing diversity of their community and trying to figure out where do we start? What do we do? There's a Venn diagram that I pulled off the internet and just relabeled. Maybe Chris could bring that up now. We could just take a look at it. For those those of you that are just listening, it's 3 interlocking circles that overlap in the middle. So the first circle is, after you do some listening, identify the needs that are expressed by those refugees and immigrants in your community, not what you think their needs are, but what they identify as the gaps in what would enable them to really thrive in the community. And then second circle, overlapping that one, are the unique skills, experiences, talents, interests, and passions of your member. And picture each of these circles as a pinwheel spinning, So each slice might be a different one of your members. Maybe one is a retired school teacher, another one is a young computer professional, another is a construction worker. So keep on spinning that wheel till it overlaps one of the needs expressed by the immigrants in your community, and you'll begin to see some possibilities. And then that last overlapping circle are the time, the resources, the space, and commitment. So for instance, you may have that young computer professional, but they're working 2 jobs right now. They just don't have the time available. But keep spinning and you'll find someone who does. And later on, that computer professional may be down to 1 job and fully able to commit their own skills and unique talents that God has given them. So each church has a different mix of these. All of these are within the field of the biblical context of the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. So loving our neighbor and as we go, serving and discipling those in our community. And that serving and discipling starts with developing authentic relationships. So looking at that second circle, look at the people and their passion within your congregation and find out what unique passions and experiences and talents do you have that match up with some of those needs expressed by the immigrants in your community. And then that sweet spot becomes the starting point for a new ministry to refugees and immigrants. And when you add an overlay of that, of other churches that you can partner with, maybe the ministry you've identified, you've got the persons that might be able to address the expressed need, but you don't have this particular space that would enable that to happen, but a neighboring church does. So if you partner with them, with your passion and your talents and their space, something new can happen. Mm. So Nancy, maybe this would be a good place for you to jump in.
Thank you, Pat. So one ministry that many churches choose to start with is an English as a second language ministry, because for all of our immigrant neighbors and our international college students, refugees, asylum seekers, for all of them, the need to improve their English is great, whether they have no English and they need to get some, or even if they have a pretty good grasp of the language, they still need to get better to help their families to get better jobs. And so what we do at Missions North America, we teach churches how to start these ministries. And what's great is our classes are divided, that we teach you how to have, are divided by fluency level, and the classes are English immersion. So when Benjie talked about the fact that, Auburn Hills is Spanish speakers, but you know what? The Russian speakers, the people from Bulgaria, maybe you've got some Japanese people down the street, all of them can be served by one ESL ministry because the classes are English immersion by English fluency level coming in. And so we're going to take lay people in your church. You're not going to have to go try to find a lot of professional teachers. We say, if you love Jesus and speak English, that we can teach you the rest. And it works. And we mean that. So when they come in, you're going to be teaching them that life skill vocabulary that they need to thrive here in America. But the gospel is in it, because we're going to have open and closing prayer and short devotions translated into every language group in your school. But those genuine, authentic relationships are the core of ESL ministry. And then once you find out those needs, that diagram that Pat had, that's when that comes into play. Because as your students grow to know you, to trust you, and they will reveal every problem they have. Think of any problem you could have, add on top of it, you don't speak the language, you don't understand the culture, right? As you become aware of those, then your ministry can expand through different mercy ministries to the immigrants in your community that will go farther than your English classes. And then we want more and more biblically centered activities. So as your students come to the classes, as you build relationships with them, as you do mercy ministry to help them and their neighbors and their family members, then after you've built those relationships, you can say, would you come study the Bible with me? We'll still teach you English, but let's study the Bible together. And we have seen so many of great relationships develop that turn into gospel conversations, that turn into our students becoming our brothers and sisters in Christ.
I'm hearing then, I don't need to be fluent in the languages.
Not at all.
So,
Not at all. If you speak English and love Jesus, if you translate in the classroom, it will slow down their learning. It will take them 6 months to learn what they could have in 6 weeks.
okay.
So if you speak their language, it's great for relationships. It's nice at registration time, but in the classroom, we don't need it.
Yeah. Oh, that's.
Can I jump in with just a, and I don't know that we really planned to talk about this, but when I was in Austin, we were a part of starting an ESL ministry and worked with MNA. And, you know, being in Austin, South Texas, Central and South Texas, such a Latino heavy area that we really just had a passion to try to help, and had a relationship with a local predominantly Spanish speaking church. And so we just took people who were interested from All Saints and went and hosted an ESL class there that averaged probably in those years, I think it's changed since I left there, but you know, in those years we would have 60 to 80 folks who were involved with some regularity. And what was fascinating was inside of that, I think you're exactly right, Nancy, that inside of that, you saw real relationships and friendships being born. We ended up, one of the families we became close to because their children went to school with our kids, and we were friends with the parents. Our kids were friends with the kids, and it just became a really natural way of partnership and around the gospel. And so that has always rolled around in the back of my mind as, you know, is that the kind of thing that we have the opportunity to do here in Chattanooga in a place like Auburn Hills? But I guess I'd push it back on you, Nancy, and just ask the question, well, okay, we're a church. We've now got a few relationships. We've got kind of a place, you know, there's not a natural, we're a church plant. We don't have a building to draw people into. What, you know, what are some of the categories that you might be thinking about for a church like ours? Do a little consulting with us.
All right. Well, we go through churches through 8 steps, and you're already through the 3rd step out of 8. Wow. So you've seen the need, right? The church leadership is on board, and you're starting to pray, how do we minister to the nations that God has sent to your doorstep? The next is to begin recruiting those volunteers to teach the classes, and then bring us in. We have a 12-hour training that we love to do in person, but we will also do it on Zoom. We have one starting this Friday night, actually, if anyone's interested. But we teach the non-professionals how to teach English using professionally written curriculum in a specific lesson planning format. And once you've got your volunteers, or concurrently as you're recruiting and training them, then you make those decisions. Where will our classes be? They don't have to be in a church building. Do you know a business that's closed at night? Do you know a restaurant that would let you have a room in the restaurant for maybe 2 hours in late evening? Is there another church that already has a building that you could partner with them? It could be in those trailers. You could have the beginner class in Jose's trailer, and the intermediate class in Lorena's trailer, and the advanced class in Lupe's trailer. You think out of that box. You do not have to have a church building. And then Don and I will guide you. There are hundreds of curriculums out there. We encourage you to use that life skill curriculum, and we will help you to pick one and to get just to get started. And so Don Boeher is an excellent example. Maybe he can speak to his church in Florida started an ESL ministry 10 years ago, and he started by being handed my business card. And all the glory goes to God. I only know anything because God has taught me through other people. But Don's church is a perfect example of what could happen.
Yeah, I went to an outreach meeting in our church. I just returned from Japan on an assignment, and I knew what it was like to be a fish out of water, not to be able to speak, not to be able to converse, not to be able to live. So our church decided to start an ESL ministry. They asked for a volunteer, and I raised my hand because like I said, I knew what it felt like. They handed me Nancy's card. They said, call Nancy. So I called Nancy the next day, and as I tell everybody, I followed exactly what she said. I didn't reinvent anything. I didn't create anything. I did steps A, B, C, D. And January 11th, 11 years ago, this past January, we began our first ESL, that first night. And so I had all the volunteers there. I had followed everything Nancy told me to do. And I remember somebody coming up to me that night and saying, how many people do you think you'll get here tonight? I said, I don't know. I don't know if we'll have anybody here tonight. Later that night, at the end, we had 99 people that had walked through our front door. The next Monday night, we had 46 additional people. We had that first year, we had over 300 people, and we have continued to have 300 people for the last 10 years. So here's a guy who can still not speak a foreign language. I had never been a teacher before. I had never created a school before, but with the Lord's help through Nancy Boeher, through our ESL ministry, we developed a ministry, and off of that, we now have an Hispanic ministry, an Hispanic church. So just like Nancy said, it begets itself. So we were able to grow into that as well. It's just a remarkable story, all from God.
So I'm going to ask the question that might come from the a segment of the church that's always concerned about, well, ministry is great, but how do we pay for this? So how much does ESL or MNA Refugee Immigration, how much do you charge for your services? You just did some consulting for Benjie. Is what bill is he going to see in the mail now that he's at step 3?
Well, if you're going to start an ESL ministry, I've actually written a book that's up on the MNA website that has all the administrative information that you will need, including how to set up a budget. And so that would be important. But this is the one thing I want people to know. If God has called you to do it, he's going to provide the resources, maybe not from the place you think, maybe not from the congregational budget, but he provides for it. And as far as our training, right now, we're mostly doing it on Zoom. We ask for a $40 donation per participant, but we realize many people have lost their jobs. I've got a lady taking the training this weekend down in Augusta, Georgia, and she said, I'm so sorry, I can't afford it. I said, that's okay, it's our gift. If you cannot afford it, it's our gift. And when we can go back to in-person trainings, which I pray is very soon, we have 25 trainers nationwide. They're all volunteers. We do ask that you pay for their travel expenses and provide them with a $300 honorarium. Now, having said that, if your church cannot afford it, and many times a church plant cannot, all you do is you tell me, and many of my trainers will go free of charge, and MNA, ESL will pay for the travel expenses. So we've never said no to anyone because God has always provided.
Never said no, but you are a ministry that needs support.
Right, absolutely. But God provides.
Yes.
God provides. When part of the body doesn't have the resources, God provides another part that does.
Yeah, no, that's great. Good. And we're getting some of those links up here, and for those attending following this, you'll be getting an email with a link to this this recording if you want to watch it or send it to somebody else, but also the contact information if you want to follow up with anyone here. One of the things I wanted to mention, and I'll likewise post, and Don, I want to be asking you some questions about Multiply. But before we get to that, Pablo did a video. Pablo, this was at Auburn Hills, correct?
Yes.
Highlighting that. And so it's a great video to watch as well. And so check that out, and the link to the YouTube site that's there. And Don, so you got involved in all of this. You were already involved with ESL, assistant director, but doing Multiply and filming it. How did all of that not just come about, but what was the takeaway for you from all of this?
Well, when we decided to take Multiply, which has been a publication from MNA with the mission to tell the story of God's hand at work through the ministries of MNA, when we decided to take Multiply and take it from the printed version and do a video version, we were looking for our first story, and we knew we wanted to start in December. And we looked at Chattanooga. As Benjie said, Chattanooga went through the pandemic, and then this devastating tornado that hit on Easter Sunday. We were sort of dubbing it the disaster within a disaster. And I went up there with the intent of looking at two churches, Covenant Presbyterian Church. There were 6 members of that church who lost their homes, totally destroyed. And telling part of what we wanted to do in December was to tell their story and also to tell Grace and Peace. But when I got there, I looked around and I talked to everybody and started the interview process and realized these are 2 separate stories. So the December edition of Multiply, which is up on our landing page, our Multiply landing page on the MNA site, and Chris can put a link to it, is about Covenant Presbyterian Church. It's a wonderful story, but it's a story of families that, as I said, lost their homes, the comfort of God during that time when the tornado was tearing their homes apart, and then going back and seeing how the body of Christ came to help them in big ways and in small ways. It's just a wonderful story. And then we looked at Grace and Peace, and when I talked to Benjie initially over the phone, and then when we went there to meet with him, I was struck by the people. And one of the things that I said this last time, one of the things that really grabbed me with Pablo and with Eduardo and Tony from last time, and Benjie and Benjie's family and other members of the church that I met, was just how they didn't know each other. This was, as Benjie says in the video, it's a scratch plant. There's no mother-daughter relationship here. These are people who didn't know each other. And 55, 60 people came together. They were separated by this pandemic, but they came together as the body of Christ. They came together as a family, and they kept stressing that. Everybody said the same thing. We became a family, and they became a family helping each other. There was one person who lost a home, and the church banded together and moved them. And then they reached out to Auburn Hills. It's just an incredible story. And that's the whole purpose of Multiply, to tell those stories. When we had the printed version, we could never feel the passion. I couldn't hear the passion of Pablo and Eduardo, but here you can see that passion. And this discussion that we're having now, this is all what Multiply is about. So anyway, so we're hoping people will go to the site, you can subscribe to it, and then each month, the December, January, each month we'll deliver a fresh new Multiply to your email inbox. It's free. Just a little plug. Next month, February, we're in Philadelphia. We go to the historic 10th Presbyterian, and we look at their mercy ministry, in particular, feeding the homeless. You know, every Sunday they open their church to the homeless. It's just a remarkable story of the wonderful works of God. So two things before I say good. So I pass it off about Multiply. Number one, share it. Share it as much as you can. Share it on social media. Share it within your church. We want to get it out there. We want to distribute it so people can see every day God at work. The second thing is, if you have an idea, if something in your church, I'm going to put my email address up. Let me know, because we're always looking for stories, and we want it to be a Multiply for the whole church.
It's what I'm hearing here is very much what true for our denomination, true for the body of Christ, but it's how we really describe MNA. MNA exists to strengthen the church, to serve, grow, and multiply.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing here. What I find so wonderful in all these stories is, you know, this is a church plant, and people, we sometimes have this in our mind. This is what a church plant does. Well, Benjie never had in mind pandemic and tornado. God did. And in that context, he brought together all these people from other PCA churches, from churches outside of the PCA, larger part of the community. So it's a wonderful picture that we often don't think about and see. And then to take that to the next step is, I think for a lot of churches, they think, ESL, that will be a good ministry down the road. When we have our own building and can host it, maybe then, when we're stable, we'll think about refugees and just like, this is what we should be doing from, or what we can be doing from the very beginning all the way through. So when we talk about church planting and church renewal, we're talking about strengthening the church. It all fits together in a wonderful way.
I think one of the things that I'm learning, and I know we're short on time, but one of the things I'm learning through all of this is that, we tend to talk about church planting in a little bit of a mechanical way. You get the right person, you do these 8 or 10 right things, and you get this outcome of a particularized church or whatever. But the reality is that church planting is more about seeing the gospel taking root in individual people's lives, that the body of Christ, kind of an Ephesians 4 model, that the body is built up for the work of ministry. It's, the individual pastor is not the most important piece. The Spirit of God is the important piece to take advantage of the opportunities that God gives you that you may want. And some opportunities like we had, we didn't really want. But God is at work in that. And that's where the real beauty of the church is. This is what we believe is God is doing. And I think it's really nice to be reminded of that. And I hope that this really sears our culture as a church, that the gospel of the kingdom becomes a central focus, not me, not our particular strategies or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for anyone that's listening, if you're thinking about, what are some good strategies, or not just strategies, but ways in which to engage our community, ESL and refugee and immigration, I think that would be a good place to consider and look at. Oh, but our church is kind of plateaued, or we're in a good steady pace. Not much new is happening. We're not thinking much outside the box. It's the same thing. Take a look at these wonderful ministries that MNA offers, and as Don had mentioned, get in touch, sign up for the Multiply, get on that mailing list, share it. And it's exciting to hear and see what's happening, but then all of this can be multiplied and spread throughout the denomination, beyond the denomination, throughout the body of Christ. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for your time. This has been great. Appreciate you all attending the MNA Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. We'll be meeting again in February the 10th. Where we're going to be talking about coaching in the context of resilient ministry, how to coach through self-care. Until then, Lord bless, and we are so thankful you're able to join with us this day. Bye.